The airport was loud that morning. Not the normal kind of loud where people talk and laugh and drag their suitcases behind them. This was a different kind of noise. It was the sound of frustration. The sound of people who had places to be, but could not get there. 3 flights had been delayed because of storms in the Midwest. The announcement boards kept changing, and every time they did, someone let out a heavy sigh or muttered something under their breath. The coffee shops had long lines. The charging stations were full. Children ran between the seats while their parents tried to keep them calm. And somewhere in the middle of all this chaos, sitting alone near gate B7, was a 68-year-old woman named Margaret. She was not like the other travelers. She was not checking her phone every 5 seconds. She was not pacing back and forth or complaining to the airline staff. She just sat there quietly, her hands folded in her lap, staring at nothing in particular. Margaret had a small carry-on bag resting against her leg. It was old and faded, the kind of bag that had seen many trips over many years. Inside it were simple things: a change of clothes, a toothbrush, a photograph wrapped carefully in a soft cloth. She was on her way to Seattle. But this was not a vacation. This was not a business trip. She was flying to attend the memorial service for her husband, Richard. He had passed away 8 months ago, and his family had finally gathered the strength to hold a proper ceremony. 42 years. That is how long they had been married. 42 years of waking up next to the same person. 42 years of morning coffee and evening walks. 42 years of small arguments and big forgiveness. And now, all of that was just memory. Margaret had not cried on the way to the airport. She had told herself she would stay strong. She had cried enough in the past 8 months to last a lifetime. But sitting here now, surrounded by strangers who had no idea what she was carrying inside her heart, she felt more alone than ever. A man in a dark suit sat a few seats away from her. He was talking loudly into his phone, his voice sharp and impatient. Something about a deal that was falling apart. Something about numbers and deadlines. He did not notice Margaret. He did not notice anyone. His world was inside that phone, and nothing else seemed to matter. On the other side of the waiting area, a young mother was trying her best to calm down a crying toddler. The little boy wanted to run, wanted to explore, but the crowded terminal was no place for that. His cries echoed off the walls, and people nearby shifted in their seats, some annoyed, some sympathetic. A few rows ahead, a young soldier sat by himself. He was still in uniform, his boots dusty from travel. He looked tired in a way that went beyond just needing sleep. His eyes were distant, and every now and then he would rub his face with both hands, like he was trying to wake himself up from a bad dream. He had just come back from deployment, though no one around him knew that. No one asked. Margaret watched all of them without really watching. Her eyes moved from face to face, but her mind was somewhere else. She was thinking about Richard. She was thinking about the way he used to hum in the kitchen while making breakfast. She was thinking about his hands, rough from years of work, but always gentle when they held hers. And then her eyes landed on something she had not noticed before. In the center of the terminal, tucked between a bookstore and a pretzel stand, was a piano. It was an old upright piano, dark wood with a few scratches on the sides. A small sign above it said, "Play me," in cheerful letters. It was one of those public pianos that airports sometimes put out for travelers to enjoy. A way to bring a little music into a place usually filled with stress. But right now, no one was playing it. No one even seemed to notice it was there. People walked past it without a second glance, too busy with their phones, their bags, their worries. Margaret stared at the piano for a long time. She used to play. A long time ago, before life got busy, before the kids came, before work and bills and all the things that slowly push hobbies to the side. She had taken lessons as a girl and had loved it. There was something about sitting at a piano that made the rest of the world disappear. But it was Richard who truly loved music. He was the real player in the family. He could sit at a piano for hours, his fingers dancing across the keys like they had a mind of their own. He played at their wedding. He played when their children were born. He played on quiet Sunday afternoons when the house was still, and the sunlight came through the windows just right. And he played in the hospital, too. Not on a real piano, of course, but in those final days, when his body was weak and his voice was barely a whisper, he would hum. He would hum the song he loved most. The song he had played for her 1,000 times, Claire de Lune. Margaret felt her chest tighten at the memory. She had not touched a piano since Richard died. She could not bring herself to do it. Every time she saw one, she would think of him, and the pain would come rushing back like a wave. She could not stop Dot, but now, sitting in this loud and chaotic airport, surrounded by strangers who did not know her name or her story, she felt something strange. It was not quite courage. It was not quite sadness. It was something in between. A pull. A whisper from somewhere deep inside her that said maybe, just maybe, it was time. She looked down at her hands. They were older now. The skin was thinner, and the veins showed more than they used to. These hands had held babies, cooked meals, wiped tears, and held Richard's hand as he took his last breath. They had done so much, but they had not played music in a very long time. Margaret did not make a decision in that moment. Not really. She just stood up. Her legs moved before her mind could stop them. She left her bag on the seat and walked slowly toward the piano. A security guard nearby glanced at her, but said nothing. A teenager sitting on the floor looked up from his phone and watched her with mild curiosity. An older woman walking toward the restroom paused for a moment, wondering what this small, quiet lady in the blue cardigan was about to do. Margaret reached the piano and stood in front of it. She ran her fingers lightly over the top, feeling the cool wood beneath her touch. Dust had gathered in the corners. It had not been cleaned in a while. But when she pressed down on one of the keys, the sound that came out was clear and true. Her heart beat faster. She thought about walking away. She thought about going back to her seat and waiting for her flight like everyone else. She thought about all the reasons why this was a silly idea. But then she thought about Richard. And she sat down. The bench was harder than she expected. The wood was worn smooth from years of use, and it creaked slightly when she adjusted her position. Margaret placed her feet flat on the floor, the way her piano teacher had taught her more than 50 years ago. Some things you never forget, no matter how much time passes. She could feel eyes on her. Not many, but a few. The teenager who had been sitting on the floor was still watching, his phone now resting in his lap. A woman pulling a bright red suitcase slowed down as she walked by, curious to see what would happen. The security guard had moved a little closer, not out of concern, but out of interest. Margaret placed her hands on the keys. Her fingers found their positions almost by instinct, muscle memory guiding them to the right places. The keys were cool against her skin. A little sticky in some spots, probably from coffee or soda that someone had spilled long ago. But they were real. They were waiting. She took a deep breath. For a moment, she could not move. Her hands just sat there, frozen above the keys like birds afraid to land. What was she doing? She was 68 years old. She had not played in public since she was a young woman. And even then, she had never been the confident type. Richard was always the one who loved an audience. She preferred to play alone, in the quiet of their living room, with no one listening but him. But Richard was not here anymore. That thought hit her harder than she expected. Her eyes began to sting, and she blinked quickly, trying to push the tears back. Not here. Not now. She had promised herself she would hold it together until after the memorial. She could fall apart in Seattle, in private, where no one would see. But right now, in this busy airport, she needed to be strong. She looked down at the keys again. 88 of them, stretching out in front of her, like an old friend she had not visited in too long. She remembered how Richard used to joke that a piano was like a person. You had to talk to it, get to know it, earn its trust. Every piano had its own voice, he said. You just had to listen. Margaret closed her eyes. And then, without thinking too much, she pressed down on the first note. The sound floated up into the air, soft and pure. It hung there for a moment, mixing with the noise of the terminal, the announcements, the chatter, the distant rumble of planes. But somehow, even in all that chaos, the note found a way to be heard. Margaret pressed the second note, then the third. The melody began to take shape. It was slow at first, hesitant, like someone learning to walk again after a long illness. Her fingers stumbled a little on the fourth measure. She hit a wrong note and winced. But she kept going. She did not stop. The song was Clair de Lune. Of course it was. There was no other song she could have played in that moment. It was the song Richard had played at their wedding, back when they were both young and full of dreams. It was the song he played when their first child was born, sitting at the old piano in their tiny apartment while she held the baby and cried happy tears. It was the song he hummed in the hospital, in those final days when words became too hard and music was all he had left. Was their song. It had always been their song. As Margaret played, the world around her began to shift. The teenager on the floor sat up straighter. His phone was still in his hand, but he was no longer looking at the screen. His eyes were fixed on the old woman at the piano, and there was something in his expression that had not been there before. He had expected nothing from her. He had seen her walk over, this small, quiet lady in her simple blue cardigan, and he had almost laughed. What could she possibly do? But now, hearing the music, he felt something stir inside him. Something he could not name. The woman with the red suitcase had stopped walking completely. She stood a few feet away, her hand still resting on the handle, her head tilted slightly to the side. She was supposed to be rushing to catch a connecting flight. She was supposed to be stressed and hurried like everyone else. But the music had caught her, as she could not move. Near gate B7, the businessman in the dark suit finally lowered his phone. He did not hang up. He just let his hand fall to his side, the voice on the other end still talking about numbers and deadlines. But he was not listening anymore. He was listening to something else. Something that reminded him of his mother, who used to play piano in their living room when he was a boy. He had not thought about that in years. The young soldier lifted his head. He had been sitting with his elbows on his knees, staring at the floor, lost in thoughts he wished he could escape. But the music reached him, cutting through the fog in his mind like sunlight through clouds. His eyes found the piano, found the woman playing it. And for the first time in a long time, he felt something other than exhaustion. The young mother with the crying toddler noticed that her son had gone quiet. She looked down at him and saw that he was staring at the piano, his small face full of wonder. He had stopped squirming. He had stopped fussing. He was just watching, completely still, as if the music had cast a spell on him. Margaret did not see any of this. Her eyes were still closed. She was not playing for them. She was not even playing for herself. She was playing for Richard. In her mind, she was back in their living room. The afternoon sun was coming through the curtains, making golden patterns on the carpet. Richard was sitting next to her on the piano bench, his shoulder touching hers, his hands resting gently on his lap as he listened to her play. He always said she was better than she believed. He always said she had a gift she was too afraid to share. She could almost feel him there now, almost hear his voice, soft and warm, telling her she was doing fine. "Keep going," he would say. "Do not stop. The music is beautiful." A tear slipped down her cheek, but she did not wipe it away. She let it fall. She let herself feel everything she had been holding back for 8 months. The grief, the loneliness, the mornings when she woke up reaching for someone who was no longer there. The evenings when the house was so quiet, she thought she might disappear into the silence. All of it poured out, through her fingers, through the keys, through the music. The song grew stronger. Her confidence returned, note by note. The stumbles faded. The hesitation melted away. And what was left was something raw and honest. Something that did not need words. Something that spoke directly to the heart. Around the terminal, more people began to notice. A pilot walking to his gate slowed down, his eyes drawn to the piano. A group of college students on their way to spring break stopped their conversation and turned to watch. An elderly man sitting alone by the window felt his eyes grow wet, though he did not know why. The music filled the space. It rose above the noise, above the stress, above the frustration of delayed flights and lost luggage and missed connections. It reminded people of things they had forgotten. It made them pause. It made them listen. And Margaret kept playing. She did not know that a small crowd was forming. She did not know that the teenager had lifted his phone and was now recording her. She did not know that strangers were looking at each other with something like recognition, as if the music had reminded them that they were all human, all carrying their own burdens, all just trying to get through the day. All she knew was the music. All she knew was Richard. All she knew was that for the first time in 8 months, she did not feel completely alone. The song was reaching its most beautiful part now. The notes climbed higher, then fell softly, like leaves drifting down from a tree. Margaret leaned into the piano, her whole body moving with the melody, her heart breaking and healing at the same time. And somewhere, in a place beyond words, she felt Richard smile. The terminal had changed. Something was different now, and everyone could feel it, even if they could not explain what it was. The noise had not disappeared. The announcements still played overhead. The coffee machine still hissed and sputtered. Somewhere in the distance, a luggage cart beeped as it rolled past. But all of that had faded into the background, like the hum of a refrigerator that you stop noticing after a while. What filled the space now was the music. It moved through the air like water, touching everything and everyone it reached. Margaret played on, her eyes still closed, her fingers moving across the keys with a grace that surprised even her. She had forgotten she could play like this. She had forgotten what it felt like to lose herself in a song, to let everything else fall away, until there was nothing left but the melody and the moment. The crowd around her had grown. It started with just a few curious onlookers, but now there were dozens of people standing in a wide circle around the piano. Some had put down their bags. Some had stepped away from their gates, ignoring the boarding announcements that called their flight numbers. Some had simply stopped in the middle of walking, unable to take another step until the song was finished. A little girl, no older than 5 or 6, tugged on her father's hand and pointed at the piano. Her eyes were wide with wonder, the way children's eyes get when they see something magical for the first time. Her father picked her up so she could see better, and she rested her head on his shoulder. Watching the old woman's hands dance across the keys, near the back of the crowd, a janitor had stopped pushing his cart. His mop hung forgotten at his side, dripping soapy water onto the tile floor. He was a man in his 50s, with deep lines on his face and hands that had known hard work his whole life. He did not know classical music. He had never been to a concert or listened to anything fancier than the radio in his truck. But this song reached him anyway. It made him think of his wife, who had passed away 3 years ago. It made him remember the way she used to hum while she cooked dinner. The way she smiled when he came home from work. The way she held his hand during thunderstorms because she was afraid of the lightning. He wiped his eyes with the back of his hand and kept listening. On the other side of the circle, two teenage girls who had been taking selfies just minutes before now stood completely still. Their phones were lowered. Their poses were forgotten. One of them had tears running down her cheeks, though she could not have told you why. She just felt something. Something big and heavy and beautiful, all at once. Something that made her want to call her grandmother and tell her she loved her. The businessman in the dark suit had moved closer. His phone call had ended at some point, though he did not remember hanging up. He stood with his arms crossed, watching the old woman play, and for the first time in years, he was not thinking about work. He was not thinking about the deal that was falling apart, or the emails he needed to answer, or the meeting he was going to miss because of the delayed flight. He was thinking about his daughter. She was 16 now. They barely talked anymore. He was always traveling, always busy, always promising he would make time for her, and then breaking that promise. The last conversation they had was an argument. She had screamed at him that he cared more about his job than he did about her. He had told her she did not understand. He had walked out the door and flown to another city for another meeting that probably did not matter as much as he thought it did. Standing there now, listening to this music, he realized she was right. The young soldier had not moved from his seat, but his whole body had shifted. He was no longer hunched over with his head in his hands. He was sitting up straight, his eyes locked on the piano, his chest rising and falling with slow, deep breaths. The fog that had been clouding his mind for weeks had begun to lift, just a little, just enough for him to see a tiny sliver of light. He had been thinking about giving up, not in any dramatic way, just fading, disappearing into the numbness that had swallowed him since he came home. He did not feel like himself anymore. He did not feel like anyone. He was just a body moving through the world, going through the motions, waiting for something he could not name. But this music, this simple, beautiful music played by a woman he had never met, it reminded him that there was still something worth feeling, still something worth holding on to. He thought about his mother. She lived alone now, in the same small house where he had grown up. She called him every week, and every week he gave her short answers and told her he was fine. But he was not fine, and she knew it, and he knew she knew it. And still, he could not bring himself to be honest with her. The song she loved most was playing right now. He did not know if it was the same version or just something similar, but it did not matter. The melody was the same. The feeling was the same. And suddenly, all he wanted to do was call her and tell her the truth. Near the front of the crowd, the young mother held her toddler close to her chest. The little boy had fallen completely silent, his thumb in his mouth, his eyes half closed like he was about to fall asleep. The music had calmed him in a way that nothing else could. All morning she had been struggling. She was exhausted. She was overwhelmed. She was traveling alone with a child who did not understand why they had to sit still for so long. And she had felt like the worst mother in the world. But now, standing here with her son peaceful in her arms, listening to this stranger play the most beautiful song she had ever heard, she felt something shift inside her. The frustration melted away. The guilt faded. She remembered why she was doing all of this. She remembered that being a mother was hard, but it was also the most important thing she had ever done. She kissed the top of her son's head and held him a little tighter. The teenager who had been recording earlier had put his phone down. He was still watching, but he was no longer thinking about how many views the video might get. He was thinking about his own grandfather, who had died last year. They had been close once when he was younger, but as he got older, he stopped visiting as much. He got busy with school, with friends, with all the things that seemed so important at the time. And then one day, his grandfather was gone, and he never got to say goodbye. He wished he could go back. He wished he could have one more conversation, one more afternoon sitting on the porch eating ice cream and listening to stories about the old days. But he could not. That time was gone. All he could do now was remember. The music reached its final passage. The notes slowed down, becoming softer, more tender. Margaret's fingers moved gently now, like she was saying goodbye to someone she loved. Each note hung in the air, a moment longer than the last, as if the song did not want to end. And then, with one final chord, it was over. The silence that followed was unlike anything the terminal had ever known. No one moved. No one spoke. It was as if the whole world had paused to take a breath. Margaret opened her eyes, and for the first time, she saw the crowd. Dozens of faces looked back at her. Some were crying. Some were smiling. Some were doing both at the same time. Strangers who had been rushing through their day just minutes ago now stood together, united by something they could not explain. Margaret's hands trembled in her lap. She had not expected this. She had not played for them. She had played for Richard, for herself, for the grief she had been carrying alone for so long. But somehow, without meaning to, she had given them all a gift. And then, slowly at first, someone began to clap. A first clap came from somewhere in the back. It was soft, almost hesitant, like the person was not sure if it was okay to break the silence. But then another person joined in, and another, and another. Within seconds, the whole crowd was applauding. It was not the polite kind of clapping you hear at the end of a school play. It was not the automatic response people give when they are supposed to show appreciation. This was something different. This was real. It came from deep inside, from a place that most people keep hidden away. It was the sound of people who had felt something they did not expect to feel, and they did not know how else to express it. Margaret sat frozen at the piano bench. Her hands were still resting on the keys, though she was no longer pressing them. She looked out at the crowd with wide eyes, completely overwhelmed by what she was seeing. There were so many faces, young and old, men and women, people in business suits and people in sweatpants, people traveling alone and families with children, all of them looking at her, all of them clapping for her. She did not know what to do. She had never been good with attention. Even when she was young, she preferred to stay in the background. Richard was always the one who loved the spotlight. He was the one who would bow dramatically after playing a song, who would wink at her from the piano bench like he was performing just for her. But Richard was not here. And somehow she had done this on her own. The applause began to fade, but the crowd did not leave. People stayed where they were, as if they were waiting for something more, as if the moment was not quite finished yet. And then the young soldier stood up. He walked slowly toward the piano, his boots heavy on the tile floor. His eyes were red, and there were tear tracks on his cheeks that he did not bother to wipe away. When he reached Margaret, he did not say anything at first. He just stood there, looking at her like she was someone he had known his whole life. Then he knelt down beside the bench so that he was at her level. His voice was rough when he finally spoke, like the words had to fight their way out. "Ma'am," he said quietly, "I don't know if you know what you just did, but I need you to know something." Margaret looked at him, her heart pounding. She did not understand what was happening. "I was sitting over there," the soldier continued, nodding toward the seats near gate B7, "and I was thinking about giving up. I've been back home for 3 weeks, and every single day has felt like I'm drowning. I didn't think anyone could understand. I didn't think anything could help." He paused, swallowing hard. "But that song you played, that was my mother's favorite. She used to play it on our old piano when I was a kid, and hearing it just now from you. It felt like a sign, like someone was telling me to hold on a little longer." Margaret's eyes filled with tears. She reached out and took the soldier's hand without thinking. It was rough and calloused, the hand of someone who had seen things no person should have to see. But in that moment, it was also the hand of someone who was asking for help, even if he did not know how to say it. "I'm so glad," she whispered. "I'm so glad you're still here." The soldier nodded, his jaw tight. He squeezed her hand once, then stood up and stepped back. He did not say anything else. He did not need to. Something had passed between them, something words could not capture. Before Margaret could catch her breath, someone else approached. It was the young mother, still holding her toddler against her chest. The little boy was awake now, but calm, his eyes curious as he looked at the piano. "I just wanted to thank you," the woman said. Her voice was shaky, like she was trying not to cry. "I've been having the hardest day. The hardest month, really. Sometimes I feel like I'm failing at everything. But your music, it made me remember why I keep going." She looked down at her son, then back at Margaret. "He's why I keep going." And for a few minutes there, I forgot about all the stress and the tiredness. I just felt peace. "I don't know how you did that, but thank you." Margaret smiled, a real smile that reached all the way to her eyes. "He's beautiful," she said, looking at the little boy. "You're doing a wonderful job. Don't ever doubt that." The mother nodded, tears spilling down her cheeks. She mouthed the words, "Thank you," one more time, then stepped away to make room for others, because there were others. A line had formed without anyone planning it. People wanted to talk to Margaret. They wanted to tell her what the music had meant to them. They wanted to share their stories. The janitor came forward, twisting his cap in his hands nervously. "That song reminded me of my wife," he said simply. "She's been gone 3 years now, and I miss her every day. But when you played, it felt like she was right there with me. Just for a minute. That was the best gift anyone's given me in a long time." An elderly man who had been sitting by the window approached next. He walked with a cane, his steps slow and careful. "I used to play piano," he said, his voice thin but steady. "Gave it up years ago when my arthritis got bad. But listening to you, I remembered how much I loved it. Maybe it's not too late to try again." One of the teenage girls who had been taking selfies earlier came up with her friend. They looked embarrassed, like they were not sure if they belonged in this moment. But the one who had been crying spoke up anyway. "I called my grandma," she said, "right after you finished. I haven't talked to her in months, and I don't even know why. But your music made me think of her, and I had to hear her voice." She cried when she answered, the good kind of crying. Margaret felt her heart growing fuller with every story. She had not expected any of this. She had sat down at that piano with nothing but grief in her heart, wanting only to feel close to Richard one more time. But somehow that grief had turned into something else. It had become a bridge, a connection, a reminder that none of us are as alone as we think we are. The businessman in the dark suit was one of the last to approach. He stood a few feet away, his hands in his pockets, looking uncomfortable. He was not used to moments like this. He was used to boardrooms and negotiations, not feelings and tears. But he cleared his throat and spoke anyway. "I owe my daughter a phone call," he said. "We had a fight before I left for this trip, and I said some things I shouldn't have. I was going to wait until I got home to deal with it. But after hearing you play, I realized that waiting is just another way of saying it doesn't matter. And it does matter. She matters." He paused, then added quietly, "So thank you for reminding me what's actually important." Margaret nodded, unable to speak. The tears were flowing freely now, but she did not mind. They were not sad tears. They were something else entirely. Around her, something remarkable was happening. The strangers who had gathered to listen were now talking to each other. The soldier was speaking with the janitor, two men from completely different worlds finding common ground in their losses. The teenage girls were chatting with the young mother, admiring her little boy and making him giggle. The elderly man with the cane was showing the businessman pictures of his grandchildren on his phone. The airport had not changed. The flights were still delayed. The announcements still droned overhead. The world outside was still rushing forward at its usual frantic pace. But here, in this small corner of the terminal, time had slowed down. Strangers had become neighbors. And all because one woman had found the courage to sit down at an old piano and play. Margaret boarded her flight to Seattle an hour later. She found her seat by the window, tucked her worn carry-on bag beneath the seat in front of her, and watched the airport grow smaller as the plane lifted into the sky. She felt different. Lighter, somehow. The grief was still there, of course. It would always be there. But it no longer felt like a weight she had to carry alone. Something had shifted inside her, and she knew that what happened at that piano was part of it. She did not know that the teenager's video had already been posted online. She did not know that it was being shared and reshared across the internet, passed from friend to friend, from stranger to stranger, spreading like ripples in a pond. She did not know that by the time her plane landed in Seattle, hundreds of thousands of people would have watched her play. All she knew was that for the first time in 8 months, she felt close to Richard again. The memorial service was held 2 days later in a small church near the water. Richard had always loved the ocean. He said the sound of the waves reminded him that some things were bigger than any one person, bigger than any one life. It comforted him. Margaret hoped it would comfort her too. The church was filled with family and old friends. People who had known Richard for decades. People who had watched him grow from a young man with big dreams into a husband, a father, a grandfather. They shared stories about him, funny ones that made everyone laugh, tender ones that made everyone cry. And through it all, Margaret sat in the front row, holding the photograph she had carried with her from Denver. It was a picture from their wedding day. Richard was sitting at the piano, his fingers on the keys, looking up at her with a smile that could light up a room. She was standing beside him in her white dress, one hand resting on his shoulder, looking at him like he was the only person in the world. That was how she had always looked at him. That was how she would always remember him. When the stories were finished and the prayers had been said, Margaret stood up. She walked slowly to the front of the church, where an old upright piano sat against the wall. It was not as nice as the one Richard used to play at home, but it did not matter. A piano was a piano, and Richard had taught her that every one of them had a voice worth hearing. She sat down on the bench and placed her hands on the keys. The room went quiet, and then she began to play Dot. It was Claire de Lune. Of course. The same song she had played in the airport. The same song Richard had played at their wedding, at the birth of their children, in the quiet moments when words were not enough. The same song he had hummed in the hospital, his voice barely a whisper, his hand holding hers until the very end. The music filled the church. It floated up to the high ceiling and echoed off the old wooden walls. It wrapped around everyone in the room like a warm blanket, pulling them closer together, reminding them why they had all gathered in this place. Margaret played with her eyes closed, just like she had in the airport. But this time, she was not afraid. This time, she was not trying to hold back tears. She let them fall freely, let the grief and the love and the gratitude pour out through her fingers and into the keys. She was saying goodbye. And she was saying thank you. And she was saying, I will carry you with me, always, no matter where I go. When the song ended, the church was silent. Then, one by one, people began to clap. Not the loud applause of the airport, but something softer, Something more personal. The sound of family and friends honoring not just Richard, but Margaret too. Honoring the love they had shared. Honoring the music that had brought them together and kept them together for 42 years. Margaret smiled through her tears and whispered, "That was for you, my love." Back in Denver, the video continued to spread. By the end of the week, it had been viewed over 12 million times. News stations picked up the story. Reporters tried to track Margaret down for interviews, but she declined most of them. She did not want fame. She did not want attention. She had simply played a song for her husband, and somehow the world had listened. But the real story was not the video. It was not the views or the shares or the comments from strangers around the globe. The real story was what happened to the people who had been there that day, that the young soldier called his mother that same night. He told her the truth. He told her he had been struggling, that he had been thinking about giving up, that he did not know how to ask for help. She cried. He cried. And for the first time since he came home, he did not feel alone. He started seeing a counselor the following week. It was hard. It was slow. But he was trying. And that was enough. The businessman called his daughter from the airport before his flight even took off. She did not answer at first. He called again. And again. On the fourth try, she picked up. He did not make excuses. He did not talk about work. He just said, "I'm sorry. I love you. And I'm going to do better." She was quiet for a long time. Then she said, "Okay, Dad, I love you too." It was not a fix. It was not a miracle. But it was a start. The young mother went home and held her son a little tighter that night. She stopped being so hard on herself. She started asking for help when she needed it. She remembered that being tired and overwhelmed did not make her a bad mother. It just made her human. The teenager who recorded the video did something unexpected. He signed up for piano lessons. He had never played an instrument before, never even thought about it. But watching that old woman pour her heart into those keys had stirred something inside him. He wanted to create something beautiful too. He wanted to make people feel the way she had made him feel. The janitor visited his wife's grave that weekend. He brought flowers and sat on the grass beside her headstone for over an hour. He talked to her like she was still there. He told her about the woman at the piano, about the song that had reminded him so much of her. He told her he missed her every single day. And when he finally stood up to leave, he felt a peace he had not felt in years. The elderly man with the cane went home and opened the closet, where his old keyboard had been gathering dust. His fingers were stiff, and the arthritis made it hard to press the keys. But he played anyway. Just a few notes. Just a simple melody. And for those few minutes, he was young again. Strangers who had never met before that day stayed in touch. They exchanged phone numbers, email addresses, social media handles. They checked in on each other. They became friends. All because they had shared one moment, one song, one unexpected connection in the middle of a busy airport. Dot and Margaret. She went back to her quiet house in Colorado. She unpacked her bag, made herself a cup of tea, and sat down at Richard's piano. She ran her fingers over the keys he had touched so many times. Then she began to play, not for an audience, not for the internet, not even for Richard, though he was always with her in spirit. She played for herself, because she finally understood what he had been trying to tell her all along. Music does not just fill the silence. It connects us. It heals us. It reminds us that we are never truly alone. One song, one moment. Countless lives changed, and it all started with a woman who found the courage to sit down at a dusty airport piano and share her heart with the world.